Good evening, everyone, and thank you all for joining us tonight. This is our last virtual event for the year for 2020. Please keep an eye on the Meadows website and social media for any announcements about the next semester's exhibitions and talks. We have some inspiring work and engaging artists lined up, so looking forward to next semester as well. And before I introduce Odette England this evening, just a few Zoom webinar tips. Feel free to use the chat function that you can see at the bottom of your screen. Say hi to any people that you know if you're so inclined. But if you have questions for Odette, please use the Q&A window to type them in. It'll just make it a little easier for us to keep track of them and make sure we get to them at the end of the discussion during the Q&A time. For any centenary students that are joining us tonight, I will share the QR code for the passport points at the end of the discussion. If you have any difficulty with that scan, because I know we've been having problems with that this semester, please email me and I'll be sure to get your points credited to your account. And now it's my pleasure to introduce Odette England. She was originally scheduled to visit with us last spring, but the pandemic arrived on our shores at the same time and things began to shut down. Thus her visit was postponed. We are very excited to have her join us today, which incidentally is Roland Barthes' birthday, whose book, The Camera Lucida, was the inspiration for her project. I first met Odette via email back in May of 2017, so it's been a couple of years now, it's hard to believe. And she reached out to me to invite me to participate in the Winter Garden Photograph Project, to which of course I replied I would love to participate. And this book is part of that Winter Garden Photograph Project, which includes a major exhibition at the Houston Center for Photography, which opened in September and runs through January of 2021. And I'll let Odette tell you more about the project in her book in a moment, but I will preface my introduction of her with my gratitude to her for including me and to say how much I enjoyed participating. Since that first email in 2017, I've had the pleasure of getting to know Odette better, and I am always impressed with the work that she does. And I will happily listen to her speak any chance I get. You guys are in for a real treat tonight. So Odette uses photography, performance, writing, and the archive to explore themes of autobiography, gender, and ritual. She is an assistant professor and artist in residence at Amherst College in Massachusetts, as well as a resident artist of the Elizabeth Foundation for the Art Studio program in New York. Her work has been shown in over 100 solo, two-person, and group exhibitions worldwide, including the George Eastman Museum, Museum of Contemporary Photography in Chicago, RISD Museum, MacDonald Stewart Art Center in Ontario, Perth Center for Photography in Australia, Durham Art Museum and Gallery in England, and so many more. She's won countless awards and regularly receives funding to support her work through competitive grants and fellowships. And she has also attended residencies in Australia, Greece, Hungary, Iceland, Spain, and the US. Most recently, she was named 2021 Lightwork Artist in Residence in Syracuse, New York. I could go on and share with you the many collections which hold her work in the contemporary art journals, magazines, and newspapers that have published her work. But I'm going to wrap this up so that we can all hear Odette speak. And with that, it is my absolute pleasure to finally introduce Odette England. And thank you so much for joining us and taking the time to speak with us tonight. And Odette, it is all yours.
Thank you so much. It's January 2017, and I'm living in Providence, Rhode Island. I'm renting the former home of the American mid-century photographer Harry Callahan, enjoying a year-long artist residency in his basement darkroom, which is mostly still intact. When I'm not reveling in this space, I'm trying to write my dissertation. And when I need to rest, I watch my daughter Hepburn, age 6, play in her winter garden, a communal park at the back of the house. As I watch Hepburn play, I think of the many photographs that Harry Callahan made of his wife Eleanor and their daughter Barbara. I think about the parent-child relationship as mediated through the act of photography or through the act of writing about a photograph. I think of Roland Barthes, the French writer and theorist, whose book Camera Lucida I'm referring to in my own research. In this book, Roland Barthes wrote of his mother Henriette, who had recently passed away. He wrote about how in his grief, he searched for a snapshot that he believed would best show her true essence as she really was. He finds one of her at the age of 5, standing next to her brother in a glassed conservatory. He calls it the Winter Garden photograph. One of the aspects of Roland Barthes' Winter Garden photograph that makes it so special is that he never shared it. It was never published in Camera Lucida or elsewhere. And so it has become one of the most famous unseen photographs in the world. I learned that this year, 2020, Camera Lucida will celebrate its 40th birthday. I imagine the many snapshots of my daughter that I could or should have made. In this intersection of semi-related thoughts, a project about the Winter Garden photograph is born. I start inviting photographic artists, writers, curators, and historians from all around the world to send me an image. I provide them with this prompt. The main criteria for the photograph you contribute is that it echoes, suggests, or reflects Roland Barthes' Winter Garden photograph. It can be an image you have made or a snapshot of yours. It can be a found photograph. It can be color or black and white. It can be made with an alternative process. It can be a contact print, a test print, or a Polaroid. It's exciting when people's contributions start arriving, sometimes 2 or 3 in one day. Some people contribute a photograph they've made especially for the project. Others choose an image from their archive, one that may or may not have been published. Some contribute an object. Some provide text with their image. Others provide only text. Our poster worker asks me, "What are you collecting?" Nothing, I tell him. I'm growing a garden. So I must thank everyone for being here this evening, today, on what would have been Roland Barthes' 105th birthday. He was born on this day in 1915. And my very special thanks to my very special friend Heather for the invitation to speak this evening. I'm going to share with you some insights and secrets and other details about this Winter Garden photograph project. So the project has 2 parts. The first part is a 320-page book that contains more than 200 photographs and texts. The book is called Keeper of the Hearth, and this Keeper of the Hearth is what Henriette's name means, so it's a fitting tribute to her. The book was published in March of this year by Schilt Publishing. And part 2, as Heather mentioned, is an exhibition of all of the photographs in the book, and that's at the Houston Center for Photography through January next year. So for Bart, this absence of the Winter Garden photograph in his book, Camera Lucida, is key. It helped support an argument that he made and that he believed in, which was that photography and memory simply don't mix. In his opinion, memory was much more a sensation than it was an image. And he believed that no one else could feel his loss of his mother as he did. No one else could feel the loss of his memories, and no one else could feel the way he felt about his mother by viewing this particular snapshot. And so, though we all know that photography and memory intertwine in different ways, there are different types of photographs and there are different types of memory, and they don't always function in the same way, and they certainly don't always function harmoniously. So it's not always a good relationship. And I think it was Jeffrey Batchen, the writer and historian, who said sometimes it feels like photographs are kind of very quietly, stealthily replacing our memories with their own. I will say it's a very unusual experience creating an entire project about a photograph that we've never seen. And the more that I read Camera Lucida during this project, the more I saw the winter garden photograph in my mind's eye, and I would conjure a picture of it for myself. But every time I did, the less I felt that I actually knew about this photograph. And, you know, the way that each of us will dream this up in our minds is going to be different. We know the winter garden photograph through Bart's words, through his phrases, through his sentences. But how do we know that he described it accurately or fairly? You know, remember, he was consumed by grief when he was writing Camera Lucida. But perhaps that doesn't matter. Not that he wasn't grieving, but perhaps it doesn't matter whether he described it accurately or not. You know, and there are also theories that perhaps the winter garden photograph never really existed, that it was a figment of Bart's imagination, or that he was describing another photograph entirely. So for these and other reasons, it felt really important to make this book, Keeper of the Hearth, image-led rather than text-led. There is some text, but it's minimal. The emphasis is mostly on pictures without words, pictures without clarifying statements or records of proof of this or that. So with that in mind, this evening, I'm going to be sharing with you images from the book with almost exclusively unpublished text and personal correspondence that would otherwise remain hidden. So I'm going to be performing the photographs for you and making them verbal and using the very words of their makers or their owners. And some of the questions that come to mind are, you know, how does seeing a photograph change the story we read, or the story we hear, or the stories that you'll hear this evening? Or how does seeing a photograph before the photograph change our view of it, as in this case here, Andrea's photograph versus the photograph that comes before it? When I was 14 years old, my mother took her own life near the lake we visited in the summers. This image that I made when I was 59 has become, in my mind, the portrait that memorializes her in the most beautiful way. In college, I found this wallet-sized portrait of my mother, which was commissioned to help my mum find a husband, and it resulted in my parents' arranged marriage. The translation is lonely person on a boat, which meant she was a single lady. Little did my mother know at the time that the Cambodian man that she was going to marry had the idea of taking the family on a boat to flee Vietnam as refugees after the Vietnam War. This colour photograph is of my grandmother Ruth on her wedding day. She died of Alzheimer's disease when I was young, and my grandfather, her husband, was the first person to hand me a camera. My relationship to photography is inextricably linked and tied to them, her loss of memory and his profound grief. Dear Odette, I have the perfect image in mind. The task will be locating it. P.S. My copy of Camera Lucida is just as heavily marked up as yours. Best, Ron Jude. Dear Ron, wonderful. It's perfectly okay if it takes you a little longer to find it. Hi Odette, I finally found the image I was looking for and popped it in the mail today. Please use the following caption: Idaho, winter, 1962. Thanks for inviting me to participate. I would really like to get this image back if possible. I've been carrying it around with me for over 30 years. Best, Ron. It was my father's picture, though I don't know if he took it or if he is in it. At some point during college, I found it in the basement of my parents' house. It has been with me ever since. I've asked my father about it, but he doesn't remember the specifics of the image, so it's still a mystery to me, but one that always comes back to my dad, to his work and life, and somehow to my relationship to him. Dear Odette, I took this photograph of my mum shortly after my dad died. We had driven to the Fort Worth Botanical Gardens where I photographed the plants like a tourist would, because I didn't know what else to do. Best regards, Kelly Connell. Written on New Year's Eve, December 31, 2017. I found a stack of photographs in a parking lot in Albuquerque. This is the best one. It's an unknown memory, someone's observation of a place and time. To me, it looks like a ski lodge on a clear, cold day. But we'll never know. My aunt tells me that this was my mother's engagement photograph. My father and mother were members of a services social club to which they belonged throughout the war. My father joined on his return from active service. The story is that they were both on the club committee and that Dad proposed to her when they went to buy the annual Christmas tree in 1946, presumably in December. They were married on April 10, 1947. The photograph was always on display throughout my childhood, and later when they moved into a smaller flat by my father's desk. A striking portrait of my mother as I never knew her. I've spent the last hour or so going through boxes of Polaroids looking for the image I had in mind. It won't look like much to anyone else. Just a view across a fence enclosed my dad's house, across the fields with the sun setting in the top corner. But for me, it has huge power. It physically hurts my heart. It crystallizes the exact feeling of the place, of my father, the isolation, of youth and a feeling of freedom and anticipation. Its power comes from the passing of those things. I visited the house recently and it's entirely covered in climbing hydrangeas, from top to bottom. Only the roof and the collapsed porch at the back are still visible. I parted the foliage and peered inside. All was almost as it was, but everything had changed. At the time of taking this picture, it felt too beautiful, too perfect a likeness of that evening, so much more about a feeling than the image itself. And even soon afterwards, I found it hard to look at. When I made this picture of my mother, I was thinking about photography and the passage of time. That's me holding the ball in the lower right-hand corner. 20 years have passed and so much has changed, but that boy and the way he looks at his mother are pretty much the same. Calais, France, 2008. Taken near the migrant camps. One of the last photos I took before I was attacked and I thought I would die. I honestly believed in that fraction of a moment that this was the place where I would die and no one would find my body for weeks, only to become a one-column story of interest in the tabloids. Made in 1964, it's the earliest existing photograph of my mother. She's sitting at the end of the table, looking directly at the camera, a child amongst a table of adults, all women. It's the chicken, it's the look in her eyes, the white socks and her shoes. In this photo album, there are no negatives. The entire album has perhaps one roll's worth of prints. As unsentimental as Hong Kongers can be, this is a tricky one. How to convince them to part with it for this project? In 2004, in my early 20s, I saw this photograph for the first time, and all of the portraits I've ever tried to make of my mother up until then, it finally clicked. It's 2018. I'm able to convince my aunt and uncle, now in their 80s, to let me borrow that wedding album again. We carry it back to my Yima's apartment. We look through all of the photographs in the album together. She is the oral historian in the family, the keeper of stories, and tells me who is who in each picture. It takes me a few days to figure out the new photograph. The hands on the writer frame are my aunt, my Yima, who is 71 now at the time of this making. She is in the photograph she is holding, but a teenager. The hands on the left are her husband's. The middle hand is mine, one hand absent for holding the cable release. On my left hand, I'm wearing my own wedding ring in Hong Kong, where gay marriage is not legal or recognised. I have a fondness for vintage snapshots of people I know and people I don't know. So I assumed that I would select one of those. But narrowing it down proved to be too difficult. Instead, I found myself drawn to the idea of searching for the essence of someone. This portrait of my friend Valena was made in 2000, much earlier in her battle with cancer. I photographed her more recently, but those were challenging circumstances to photograph in, and just being with her was always more important than making pictures. Dear Odette, my first thought is that I might submit something from my own archive of snapshots of my mother from her childhood. Now that both of my parents have passed away, my mother nearly 20 years ago, my father in the past 3 years, these old prints that have lingered in shoeboxes and these old slides in dusty carousels have taken on added mystery and significance. In the interim, I wanted to send you a scan of a Polaroid. It holds something for me. I always felt that it had a kind of immediacy, a casualness to the angle of my mother's turn from the dresser to the photographer, undoubtedly my father. She is so in the moment, unfettered. Recently, it occurred to me that she is holding another Polaroid in her hand, and that the image on the second picture is the one with which I am familiar. It is a picture of me that had been made moments earlier. There's a kind of circular logic to this endeavour, as I seek something of her essence despite her absence. The inclusion of that other Polaroid makes it seem something other than a completely closed circle. It gives me a point of entry. Window, mirror, and prism. So maybe this is the one. I'm looking for a photo I haven't seen in ages, a photo of my mum, with me as a baby lying asleep over her chest. That photo always seemed absolutely ancient, a relic from another time. The photo was kept on display in a scratched plastic photo cube that I would inspect endlessly, turning it, but never being able to see all of the surfaces at once. One of the sides, the one that turned away from me, would always hold some kind of secret. We'd learned about cubes in school, but here was one in real life, one side of it always hidden and also upside down. I tug at it and it slides open and the photographs inside fall gently to the floor. I see that they were not really square. They had been made squares. They had been inexpertly cut into that shape. The edges are rough, cracked, brittle, folded roughly over the cardboard insert so that inside the cube they would have overlapped. The photograph of my mum and me lands on the table. And now I'm holding a piece of card that's folded into a cube. It's printed with more photographs, other photographs, photographs of strangers, a lady with a baby, a family who are happy and more real, a small voice whispered, than my very own family. My friend Ewan Shet told me a story about this picture. A woman gave me her picture and a picture of her first son. He had gone to study in Havana. When her second son found out that she had contracted the disease, he beat her almost to death. He put her in the hospital. She said if she died before she saw her first son again, would I give the picture to him? I said I would try, but how can I find him? This picture was taken in 1986. His name is not on the back. I took the woman to a photo studio and we put them together to make one image. The mother carried this new picture around with her for years. Instinctively, Ewan Shet saw the photograph as a space to reunite lost loved ones across time and death. And she knew a thing or two about dealing with loss. Like many young people under the Derg, Ewan Shet had many friends disappear. Ewan Shet herself was sent to prison when she was 18. The other prisoners were intellectuals that threatened the regime. Ewan Shet was arrested for, as she says, only God knows why. This is the only photograph of my birth mother pregnant with me. It is a blown up and stripped down section of a picture my grandmother took, unaware that she was in the background. Written on Valentine's Day, February 14, 2018. A young bride before her wedding, sharing a moment with one of her bridesmaids while another bridesmaid is reflected in the mirror over the bride's shoulder. I do not believe it is hyperbole to say that this photograph contains the story of my entire existence, and it's probably the reason I became a photographer. To quote Bart, it exists only for me. You see, the bride's name is Anne. She was my father's college sweetheart and my mother's college roommate. This photograph is from her wedding to my father in 1970. Anne died during childbirth 5 years after this photograph was taken. A year after her death, my father married my mother, the bridesmaid in the reflection. And 5 years later, I was born. I don't know when exactly, but at some point early in my parents' marriage, my mother discovered this photograph in their wedding album. She was shocked to see this image of herself floating over Anne's shoulder, a spectre solemnly standing with her hands clasped and her head down as if in prayer. She doesn't remember the photograph being taken. The angle of the composition creates the illusion that my mother's reflection is kissing the veil of the tragic bride. The photograph's flash illuminates the side of her face in the style of Caravaggio and catches the gold bracelet on the other bridesmaid as she tenderly touches the veil, creating a specular highlight. For my mum, this photograph functions as the Rosetta Stone to her life, unknowingly waiting in the wings to marry Anne's husband, to raise Anne's daughters as her own, and to become my mother. For me, this photograph exemplifies photography's inescapable connection to death and the role that photographs play in reimagining our pasts in search of meaning. And yet, it still haunts me. Before I read the final few pieces, I'd like to formally acknowledge and thank the more than 200 people, including Heather, who contributed to this almost 3-year project that utterly consumed me. I'm indebted to them, to the essayists, to the sequencing and editing team, to the designer Cara Buzzle, to the proofreaders, the printers, and to Martin Schilt of Schilt Publishing, because this work absolutely did not happen in a vacuum. and would be little more than dust bunnies running around under my bed without every single one of these people. On your last night, I read to you about how birds migrate thousands of miles. Your voice from the past asking, how did they know? Venus was sparkling over your head. The light lingered until dawn. As we watched your last breath, Mum reached for the blackbirds that she saw rising above you. Odette, I'm speechless. The book is gorgeous, just beautiful. Thank you for including me in this monumental project. The backside of the Polaroid and the subtle shadows worked. I wanted to share with you that I received the book the day after we lost my grandmother, my mother's mother. The photograph I shared with you was a different version of my mother. In that redacted image, she was more whole. Before we lost my brother of an unknown genetic disorder. That effacement marked for me how that version of her was no longer. And I receive your book the day after she shifts again, saying goodbye to her own mother. We are such fluid beings, and the image is indeed a puncture in time. All my best, Sonia. Dear Odette, I'm so sorry for my long silence after your lovely invitation. I did receive the envelope and brought it cross-country with me when I went west in December. Every time I receive one of your gentle reminders, I tell myself, I'm going to do this now. But then I keep coming back against the same wall every time. For me, the central conceit of Bart's Winter Garden photograph is its invisibility to us, his readers. The complete intransmissibility of the image's meaning for him. He does not show it to us because it could only fail to be anything that it means for him. Its coding, resonance, and emotional impact exist within a relationship to his mother and his experience that cannot be shared. And so I always conclude that I can't show a winter garden photograph of my own for that same reason. It feels like a betrayal of both his argument and my own singular experience. And when I try to conceive of an image that refuses, that seems coy or insincere. I have struggled with this for many months. I fear I must resolve that I cannot send you any such photograph for reasons of sentiment, selfhood, and stubborn belief. Warmly and with regret, Nicholas Molnar. Thank you so much for listening, and I would be delighted to answer any questions that anyone has. Thank you again.
I can't even believe that much, that it's been 40 minutes since you started talking. It was just wonderful.
Has it?
Thank you. Yes. Okay, so while we wait for people to potentially gather their thoughts and type, oh, Jeff sent in a question. Jeff says, all, if not most of these images deal with trying to rescue the past from the loss of memory. How should we read the current digital obsession with the selfie? Are we too anxious about disappearing or about death?
Wow, what a great question. I think people make selfies for many reasons, and I I don't do it often, and I do it, and I'm trying to think why I do it. Why would I make a photograph of myself and on share that? Is it because I want it to be shared? Is it because I want to be seen? Is it because with so much digital noise, so many of us crave to be seen? Is it because in 2020 being seen means being mediated more than ever through the staticky grey of a screen? I don't know. I can only speak for why I sometimes make them, and in part, I think it's because someone once said to me that you should always remember what you look like at a point in time, because at some point you'll be sorry that you forgot that you looked like they. And that assumes, of course, that you think you look good at one given point in time. I think I do it ritualistically, habitually. I don't know what I look like until I see myself in a photograph. It's not the same as looking in a mirror. It's not the same as, it's like seeing someone's expression when they see you and they haven't seen you for a long time, or they see you and they're thrilled to see you. There's what you think you look like, and there's what you do look like. And I think for me, that's what I'm interested in. I'm just interested in the act of looking, how people see, and how we are looked at and perceived by virtue of a surface, because we are a surface reflected back in someone else's eyes. Why other people do it, or why people share it, or why there's an obsession with it, I feel like this is where I want to call on my friend, the historian Kim Beale, on the West Coast, who's written a wonderful book about good pictures, and she talks about selfies within that. I'm not sure. It's a great question. I will probably chew on this for a good few days.
Yeah, I think that it's hard not to think about that as a question, especially when you're, in the academic world and teach photography to the newer up and coming photographers and artists in the world, especially trying to connect with what is present and such a ubiquitous part of life now. Um, and it's I oftentimes struggle with that too, thinking about like what differentiates like a selfie from a photograph or a real portrait or a self-portrait, and what is the difference between them, because there seems to be some subtle distinct difference, but it's really hard to, those lines are blurring, and I think it's really hard to kind of pin that down and describe it, define it.
Mm. Well, I
So
think
yes,
a selfie is also, I mean, a selfie is a lovely, quicker way of saying a self-portrait, but I think it also has something to do a little bit with how we control the device and how we look. When someone else takes our photograph, we are giving of ourselves in some way to the person in control of the device. When we're making a photograph of ourselves, we're in control of the device, and we can rephotograph ourselves if we're using a phone as many times as we desire to get whatever rightness that we're looking for, the right light, the right look, the right dimple, the right expression. And so it gives us more control over our image as mediated by a device that we are also then in control of.
yeah. I want to change the topic a little bit while we wait to see if another question comes in. I remember one of the first talks that I heard you talking about this book was back in March. It was, through Zoom. And you were talking about the process of designing the book and figuring out what images were going next to which. And I was wondering if you wouldn't mind sharing a little bit about that process here tonight too.
Sure, thank you. It was by far the most challenging part of the task, and it took the most time. When you're given 200 images, or 211 images to work with and to sequence thoughtfully, meaningfully, it seemed undoable for the longest of times. And I was most fortunate that the designer, Cara, And the students, Travis, Kevi, and Jacina, who were working with me at the time, were most patient and thoughtful about thinking about relationships, both aesthetically, formally, conceptually. And we started by just making little pairings or little groupings of images and putting them together in conversation, and to see how they would speak together and how they would speak out from a book form. And then we started thinking about some kind of order. And when you're, I at some point, I should have realized this earlier, but at some point you suddenly, it dawned on me that these 211 flat lives and loves of many people that, you know, some people I knew, but many that I didn't know or didn't know well, was incredibly intimidating. Some of these images people had to search for 14 months to find just the image that they wanted, that they'd had in their care for 30, 40, 50 years. And now it was my responsibility to somehow do justice to the image and the feeling behind it and all of the things that sit at the periphery of a photograph anyway, in conversation with 210 others. And we went through, I will probably get this number slightly wrong, but it was something in the vicinity of somewhere between 27 and 32 drafts of sequencing 211 pictures in a meaningful way, because nothing was edited out. Everything that every person contributed was included in the book. So it wasn't a case of weeding out things that were difficult to reconcile with another. I didn't feel that I could do that. Who am I to say what constitutes a winter garden photograph? Who am I to say what constitutes a photograph of meaning to someone? That speaks exactly to what Bart was saying in Camera Lucida, which is, this is a picture that no one else will feel the same way I feel about, and therefore I can't show it. I felt the same way about 211 images, that even if I don't feel anything for this particular image in the same way that its owner does, I need to make it work.
Mm-hmm.
And that every time you would move one, it was like a Rubik's Cube, where you just wanted to peel off the stickers and make it easy for yourself. And I didn't have the luxury of doing that. I had to sit and wrestle with it until there was this quality of rightness that made sense. And I think one of my biggest hopes from the project was that everyone's work was suitably made right in this particular book form. Of course, you can edit and sequence a book in with 211 images in however many ways mathematically that equates to, but it was really important that it's with 320 pages too, it's a thick book, that it felt like people weren't getting lost or bored, or that the reader wouldn't suddenly come to attention in a way that felt awkward.
Yeah.
And so it was a constant process of making an edit and then going through the edit and sitting with it, because the way we feel about anything on any given day changes, mood, weather, whatever is going on in life. And so my hand was on this book, or the edit thereof, every day for almost 14, 15 months of just editing, recycling, changing. And then someone might change their image, or, very sadly, there were 3 or 4 people who during the making of the book, their mother passed away. And, of course that changes. Do we include the image? Do we not? And so there were always things to have to work with. And I felt, if nothing else, I had to be true to people's wishes. If this was the image, or if things needed to be changed, so be it. And so it was worth it for that. I feel like, if nothing else, it was a genuine and authentic attempt to make it good and right.
Well, I think you have done a beautiful job. That book is stunning. Do you have 2 more questions? Mariani has asked, any thoughts about what Roland Barthes might think about this book?
Oh, what a great question. and I don't know what Roland would make of this book. I feel like if he was someone who wouldn't have wanted to show a photograph that was so dear and special to him of his mother that he didn't think anyone would understand. I'm not sure he would feel great about me asking 200 odd people to say, hey, let me put together an anthology of what your winter garden photographs look like. And he's, Bart was so wedded to the word, to language. Perhaps he would say, perhaps, the book should have been all words. It should have been describing these pictures. It should have been as he did. I have no idea. That's a really great question. I need to ask someone who actually knows or knew Roland Barthes at some point. And there was someone involved in the editing of the book who had met Roland twice, Ernesto, who said he was a very kind and gracious man.
I do remember you saying in one of the talks that I listened to about how it felt like, since his book is all about words and doesn't describe the image, like you felt like your book should be all images with very little words to kind of pair or complement with that. And I just thought that was a really beautiful kind of way to think about it too.
Yeah, I'm glad I did it. And every now and then I think about all these beautiful stories and words that describe the pictures.
Mm-hmm.
And in rereading them, even tonight in rereading them, there's a lot felt through language. There's a lot felt through pictures.
Mm-hmm.
And sometimes it's nice when those feelings are separated out.
Mm-hmm.
And I think photographs are so quick now. They're speedy and they're quick and they're light on their feet. And I felt I wanted this. I mean, it's a heavy book, and I wanted it to feel heavy. I wanted it to be something you had to lift with some weight behind it, an effort behind it, and then pick it up and sit with an image, because it seems like something that we don't do enough of because we're so busy swiping or click, delete, some mechanism that's based on technology, which is a wondrous thing too. But wouldn't it be nice just to sit with an image without text, without knowing how big it is, without knowing whether it was made 20 years ago or 2 minutes ago,
Mm-hmm.
and just let the imaginative force go at work, and then to skip over ones that perhaps you're less interested in to get to something where you just let it wash over you like a wave.
Mm-hmm.
And behave like language, behave like text, behave like Bart's description of the winter garden photograph does. So it's, I'm still very glad I did it, because if anything, I would like it to be slow. I would like it to be a slow read. I like it when photographs become just a little more tardy.
Yeah. I can say, like, I've had this book in my house since I don't know, what was it, March maybe that it arrived, and I still enjoy looking at it. I feel like I discover something new every time I sit down with it. So instead of talking about that, I'm going to go ahead and ask another question from Jeff, I think, because we've got enough time for this one. I think it's a multi-part question. He says or asks, do you think the multiplicity of digital images we all carry in our cloud archives will overwhelm memory in the future or transform it? Will a winter garden photograph even be possible if someone has thousands and thousands of images to sift through to try and process?
Yeah, it's interesting the way in which we are gathering, collecting, less collating perhaps, or organizing, structuring, keeping images. There was for a little while some interviews with different photographers. I forget where, but one of the questions in the interview set was, how many pictures do you have on your phone? And almost every single person would say, 4,792, or, some incredibly large number. And I think it's great that there's different ways in which we collect them now and keep them. For me, it's, do we revisit them, or do we trust that they're stored and safe? And is that how is that revisitation happening, if at all? Like, if I think back to Victorian England, where you would invite someone into if you were in a middle class family, and you would invite someone into your home, and you would sit in a parlor, and part of the exchange of conversation and that visit would be sharing a photograph album and sharing stories. It's so much has changed in the way that we value, rate, rank, assess, share images of different types. And I'm curious about the conversations that are lost because of that, and how many more images we take when the preciousness of what film used to do is taken away. Like, if I think about my grandparents rurally making photographs, they would make one of one event, birthday party, make a photograph, too expensive to make a second one. You might only do it if someone said, hey, your finger was over the lens. And then it would be another 3 months before the next photograph would be taken, because nothing else special enough happened in that time. And so there were certain kinds of events and activities that were photographed once or twice, at least in my family. And then the film might be processed a year later. But there was an incredible specialness and weight around expense, around time, about what was considered worthy of photographing, and then where those pictures would end up, which was almost always ostensibly some kind of book form, whether it was an album or something similar. And digitally, I'm not, we don't necessarily do that. I know I don't. If I'm photographing on my phone, I'll probably take 10, 15, 20 pictures of the one thing when I just really need one picture, maybe two. And there they sit. I don't necessarily categorize them. I look at how much quota of space I've got left, and go, oh, I've got 2 gig left. Oh, that's, how much more can I squeeze out of that? And then I look back to 2016. Do I really need it? Probably not, and delete. So it's this accumulation phase and then a deletion phase. And in that, I also wonder then, what are we giving up that perhaps we would have held more tightly, more closely, with more interest in 10, 15, 20 years? Or will, if technology have moved on so far by that point, they'll be like, phone, really? What? Nah, we've got this other mechanism of doing it. But I keep coming back to that question of revisitation, what's worthy of photographing, how often we do it, and then do we even look back? Do we do it? What's the intent behind it? Do we do it because we think it's important enough to do? Do we do it because it's just so much more accessible and easy? But with that ease, what does ease refuse, or what does ease delay or take away?
And that's something that we could think about and talk about, I think, endlessly, because it just kind of takes you down this very deep rabbit hole. Start thinking about that and comparing it to, times past, either in our lifetime or the generations that came before us. And I know in my family, it was every summer I go spend with my grandparents, and my sister and I would always bother my granddaddy saying, hey, slides, will you show us the slides? And he would, get out the slides and put them in the carousel, and we'd sit there and go through all of these photos every summer. We made him do that. And it was something really important and special about that. But I can't imagine now, going there and being like, granddaddy, show us your phone, and like sitting there for hours flipping through, somebody else's phone. It feels a little different, but it might also be because of my generation and when I grew up and what I grew up with. So it is an interesting question, definitely to be thinking about. So we are at the 8 o'clock hour. I don't see any other questions popping up, so I'm going to go ahead and wrap this up and say thank you to everyone who attended this evening, and thank you, Odette, so much for your beautiful performance tonight. and sharing such wonderful and amazing images from the book tonight. Um, and yeah, thank you. Thank you, everyone. And I hope everyone has a beautiful rest of your evening.
Thank you so much, Heather, and thank you, everyone.